Episode 9 Heirlooms and Relics. Greetings and welcome, true believers and forever deniers alike. You found yourself in my dark and sordid little corner of the world. My name is Jessi, and I'm here to share the many and varied tales of the things that hide in the dark. And so sit back, put your feet up, and listen to today's submission. Today's saga comes to us as a submission from username SneckScales2186. Hey Jessi, love the show. Been listening only for a couple weeks, but I went back and listened to them all. I have a saga here that I think you'll relate to. I lived, with my grandparents for most of my life, and they had tons of things that were off limits to the curious-minded child. The fine china dishes, the depression glass, the little figurines that dotted the house. My grandfather had converted the garage into a typical man cave with his own little bar, some neon signs, sports flags, and jerseys everywhere. Wasn't allowed to touch those either. Honestly, sometimes it felt like I couldn't touch anything without adult supervision. I loved my Grammy and Grandpa, but they had already raised kids, and while they took me in when my parents passed, they were little more than out of touch with the current time. Couldn't really blame them, but in my child's mind, I hated being there sometimes. Looking back on it, I feel bad for feeling like that, for everything that happened. My Grammy loved to collect things. I've heard it's a pretty old person thing to do. Apparently all my buddies at school said their grandparents did the same. Collecting dishes, antiques, dolls, knickknacks of just every kind. I know that every generation collects something, but it's like their generation needs to have just junk. I know they like it, and I'd never say it to my Grammy's face, but her collection of little clay-baked angels and figurines of people dancing or skating, well, they're just junk. It's not worth the price she paid for each one of them. And they do nothing. They just sit there. But it made her happy, so I oftentimes found myself dragged along to some antique show or flea market on the weekends. Sometimes we'd go to other people's houses and trade different figurines like they were hockey cards or something. My grandpa would generally stay home during those days, grab a beer or something and relax in his cave. Honestly, I think they just like doing their own things. They were a good couple, been together for longer than I even know, but they discovered that they weren't going to like all the same things, and so they did their own separate thing at times. I know, I'm kind of rambling here. I just want you to understand the type of household we were. We weren't really involved in anything dangerous, not anything occult. We didn't watch ghost hunting shows. We didn't really even read that much. We weren't the type of people to attract dark forces or monsters. We were just ordinary small-town folk. We weren't churchgoers. Grammy had been the one to go most of the time, but when they took me in at age 6, she stopped going. Never really told me why, but I was more than happy to not have to get up early Sundays to go sit on hard wooden benches and listen to a priest quoting and misquoting a book written thousands of years ago. I got to watch cartoons instead. And that was my life for a long time. Sometime in my teens, I think I was 13 or 14, going to the antique shows and flea markets, they became a choice, since I was old enough and trusted enough to be home alone. Probably would have been earlier, but I had accidentally broken one of Grammy's figurines while looking at it out of idle curiosity. It was some 80-year-old figure of some goddess or something I didn't recognize. I had dropped it. She was so mad that day, literally the maddest I'd ever seen her. She hadn't yelled much, but her face had gotten really red and I'd been sent to my room for the next couple of days. But eventually she moved past it, and her and Grandpa decided I could just be left alone. So most weekends I spent at the park with friends or watching cartoons and honestly just kind of being bored. I had toys and games and books and everything, but sometimes I was just mindlessly bored for no real reasons. So every once in a while, I chose to go, if for no other reason than to alleviate my boredom. Plus, I think she liked when I came with her. She never made a big deal about it, but her eyes always seemed to light up when I told her I was coming with. That's why I was there that day. It was a few weeks shy of my 18th birthday, and I hadn't gone to the last 4 or 5, maybe even more shows, so I was feeling just a little bit bad. So I told her I'd go as long as we could stop for food. She chuckled. I remember that more clearly than most of the rest of the day. I don't really know why. She chuckled a bit and said, sure, we'd stop at Harvey's or something. I love burgers, so I was already celebrating when we hopped in the car. Most of the trip there was silent. Grammy was old and tired most days, so she didn't speak much, but on antiquing day, she was a bundle of energy and usually talked my ear off. I remember she was still excited, still bouncing like a child on the way to a party or to the toy store. She was just weirdly silent. We got about 3/4 or so of the way there before she started talking. I'd been largely preoccupying myself with watching the countryside flying by and the new boys at school, basketball players tall and lean. Honestly, I'd barely noticed her silence till it was broken. She looked over at me quickly. Hey, babushka, her favorite nickname for me. I looked back at her quizzically, kind of jolted from my reverie a little. She smiled and told me she was looking forward to this trip more than possibly any other. I frowned and asked her why. It wasn't unusual for her to over-exaggerate a little, so I figured she was probably knew there was going to be some particular old figurine or something. She smiled again, and there was something off about it. Like the kind of smile one might make when they're afraid, but trying not to let it show. I didn't look too much into it that day, and that gives me pause. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd known what was coming, if knowing would somehow have changed anything. But I didn't, too distracted with my teenage life to really look too far into Grammy's. She told me she'd been talking to some antique dealer the last few trips, one who'd promised her some of the rarest finds and had delivered those finds. She'd been unable to afford them, but had been slowly selling some of her collection for this one piece he had, this heirloom from a couple centuries ago. I was taken aback, frankly. I'd never known her to sell any of her collection, and I hadn't noticed any of her figurines missing. Though, to be fair, on that one she had a lot of them. She could probably sell 50 or more, and I wouldn't have noticed. I asked her if she was okay then. She was selling her antiques? Were we hard up for money? I didn't have a full-time job then, just a part-time shift at a local movie theater, but I'd been more than willing to help where I could. She laughed and told me no, that everything was okay on that front. The antiques were just that pricey. I thought for certain at that point that she was being swindled, and I said as much. She just smiled, that same half-frightened-looking smile, and told me that she'd had them independently appraised, and they told her it really was worth what he was charging. That set my mind at ease a little, and to be honest, it was nice to see her so excited for something. Then we arrived at the market, and it was one I hadn't been to before, but by the way she navigated the oddly labyrinth-like parking lot, I knew Grammy had been here more than once. We got out, and I was surprised to see some pretty young people there. None my age, being just shy of 18, but early to late 20s, early 30s, not just the octogenarians that usually populated these events. I followed Grammy, weirdly looking forward to seeing whatever it is that had lit such a fire in her. We walked around for a while, as we usually did, stopping at different booths and stalls to just view what they had, never really buying anything. There were a few shiny little knickknacks that I actually liked a little, and the food stalls had some good food that I bought with my own money. We'd been there for a couple hours before we found it. Now, for those unaware, the stall and booths at these types of markets get rented out, usually on a per weekend or per event basis, so the stalls that you liked are generally not in the same place event to event. Some have permanent stations, but most of the time you have to wander around to find your favorite vendors. Which is what happened to my Grammy, and as the moment that we saw that stall, she made a beeline for it. I'd never seen her move so fast. I smiled a little and chased after her, really wanting to see what strange thing she'd been so enamored with. I saw the sign above the stall, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. Anton Scrivener's Curiosities. It was plain. Written with what seemed to be a marker on a plain white Bristol board, probably picked up from the local dollar store. That feeling that Grammy was being swindled returned, and I wish I'd listened to that. I had no idea just how right that feeling was. I got there and she was already excitedly talking with the man behind the vendor's table, presumably Anton. They chatted like old friends, and he even called her by name, something I rose an eyebrow at. Even vendors she'd been shopping at for years didn't really remember her name. I was a little impressed, but it made me all the more worried, too. I tried interrupting to ask him about his wares, but before I could, I realized he didn't have any. His table was empty, save for a cardboard box full of his business cards and a couple of photos of pieces he'd sold in the past. My suspicions skyrocketed, and I loudly cleared my throat, something that made the two of them pause to look at me. I politely asked where his wares were. How could he be a vendor with nothing to sell? He chuckled with an ease that led me to think it wasn't the first time he'd been asked that. He told me he didn't own any wares, that his services were more about locating and obtaining curiosities, specific ones. I asked him to clarify, and he just laughed, a gentle one that somehow had me on edge. When someone wants something specific, like an heirloom or a relic, I find it and obtain it for them, then sell it back to them. I'd heard of people who'd done this sort of work before, but they'd usually been licensed through some big auction house or other. He definitely did not seem to be some auction house bigwig. He was tall but slight, with dark brown hair and blue eyes that seemed to almost glow. He was young, at least compared to most of the other vendors, and I'd guess late 20s, maybe early 30s. Not unattractive. There was a presence about him, too, one that made him seem like he knew more than he was letting on, no matter what he was talking about. He looked at me like he expected more questions, then turned back to my Grammy. I do have the piece you were asking about. Would you like to see it? This This one question, it lives in my head rent-free every day. He'd asked my Grammy, but somehow I felt like he was asking me. I could say no, I could tell her that he was a snake oil salesman, that she was wasting her time and money, that we could go get some of the other pieces we'd seen on our way here and try to buy back the parts of her collection that she'd sold. I could have, I know it. I know I could have just opened my mouth and spoke, but I didn't. I stood there silent as she nodded vigorously, looking to be almost drooling. I just stood there as he turned around, bent into one of the cardboard boxes he had behind him. I heard some clinking and I saw some packing peanuts fall out of the box. He then turned holding the ugliest goddamn thing I've ever seen. It looked to be a twisted version of some of the figurines that Grammy had at home. The face, it was disproportionate. The nose was too long, the teeth fanged and smiling. The body looked snake-like, like it was human or humanoid, but it was long and twisting, reminding me of a snake. The paint on it was rubbing off, though even I could tell that was from age, not forgery. Hell, who'd want to forge something so disgusting? My Grammy reached her hands out, looking for all the world to be a toddler asking for a snack. He handed it to her without hesitation, something I was a little surprised at. She hadn't paid him yet, and I had fully expected him to not let her touch it until she did. He wouldn't be the first vendor to enforce that rule. A lot of the pieces on sale were very old and very delicate, so it wasn't unreasonable that they not want people touching them, at least until they got their money. But he let her touch it, pick it up and inspect it, eyeing every part of it. Honestly, at one point I thought she was going to break out a jeweler's monocle and inspect the crevices, but after a few minutes of odd silence, she nodded and thanked him, this Anton Scrivener. He just nodded and she pulled out a huge wad of cash. Now, I'd known she'd had to have had the money, since most of the places were cash only, but it's another thing entirely to see your grandmother pull out thousands of dollars in bills and just hand them off. Honestly, I was too stunned to even say anything. I'd never even seen that much cash all at once. He didn't bother counting it, just pocketed it and nodded his thanks. He wished us well and told us to be careful with it. It was one of a kind. Grammy nodded gravely and held onto it like it were a baby as we headed out to the car. I asked her about it and about that vendor, but she just laughed it off. Said it was something she'd seen a photo of as a kid and had been obsessed with ever since. She hadn't really expected to ever find it, but Anton had approached her at one of these events and given her his card. Said he'd heard through the antiquing grapevine that she'd been looking for some rare pieces, which she had. It wasn't the first time someone had approached her similarly. She hadn't had high hopes until a few days ago when he'd called her saying he'd found it. Something told me she was afraid of jinxing it, which is why she hadn't said much till we were almost there. I smiled, told her I was happy for her, and kind of put it out of my mind. Then we went and got burgers and headed home. Grandpa welcomed us back, asked how the trip was. We said it was great, and he just smiled and went back to his paper. The next few weeks passed by quickly. School was getting hard as exams approached, and I spent most of my time studying. I didn't go to the next few antique shows mostly due to studying, rather than cartoons for once. Grammy and Grandpa told me that they were proud of my dedication to my studies. I was in the kitchen, studying at my table, when I noticed. Grammy had always been specific on the placement of her figurines, and while I didn't know them all, I knew that the one on the shelf next to the table was an angel, her hands clasped in prayer. Instead, on that day, there was what looked to be a miniature version of the ugly, snaky idol she'd bought a few weeks prior. I asked Grandpa about it, but he just shrugged, said he wasn't sure, that Grammy had replaced a few of her figurines with these little ones. I asked what he meant, and he pulled me into the living room. There was about 10 identical-looking, mini-snake-looking idols. I asked when she'd gotten these ones. He frowned and said he wasn't sure, that he thought it odd, but Grammy had said it was just what she'd wanted to do. I was starting to get a little creeped out then. The eyes all seemed to be looking at me. Grammy got home late that night, and when I asked about them, she just said it was what she wanted. I went to bed more confused than anything else. I spent most of the night tossing and turning, unsure of what was going on, why those eyes kept staring at me, why Grammy was acting so odd. The next morning I woke up and screamed. On my nightstand was one of those freaky things looking at me while I slept. Grandpa had come running and burst in, asking me what was wrong. When he saw what was beside me, his eyes widened, almost like he was afraid. He told me he'd woken up with one beside him too. Then we went downstairs to talk to Grammy, but she kept dodging the questions. At one point, I even noted that her teeth looked sharp. Grandpa and I resolved to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. We waited until the next time she left the house, gathered up all of the damn things we could find, tossed them all in a garbage bag. We found about 50 of them, but we couldn't find the original. We figured she must have had it in her car or something. We also realized that a huge amount of her old collection was now missing, about 50 of them. I remembered that I had that guy's card, and we called him, asked him what was going on, what the idol really was. He said he had no idea about the mini ones that we'd seen, but the way he said it made me think otherwise. Then he said that the original idol had belonged to some failed religion about 200 or so years ago, and that the deity the idol depicted was a nameless snake god, one that tolerated no worship of other deities, one that supposedly had 1,000 young. Apparently the young would feast on the heretics. My grandpa and I exchanged a look at that. Many of her figurines were religious or had some kind of tie to religious symbology. Like the angel, it wasn't from a religious collection, but it was an angel after all. We asked him to take the idols back, but he said he couldn't. There were no returns on anything he sold. That it belonged to whoever bought it. He had no ownership now. We'd hung up in anger and realized the sun had set and that Grammy still wasn't home. We called the friends she had, but none had seen her that day. Grandpa told me to wait home in case she come back, and he went out to find her. I called the police to leave a missing persons report, but they weren't really helpful. They took down her information, but told me it was unlikely they'd find her. I was really worried at that point. It was almost midnight when there was a thump on the door. I ran to it, having almost nodded off in the living room. I ripped the door open to find Grandpa. He was red-faced and covered in sweat, pulling something huge behind him. I say pulling, he was more dragging it, but gently, like he was afraid it would break. He pulled it in, and I saw it for the first time. He leaned against the door, panting as I stared at the huge figurine. The statue of that damned snake god. It was person-sized, not the almost foot-tall version it had been in the market. I frowned and asked what the hell this was. He just looked at me, panting, his chest heaving. It's her. He barely got the words out. I opened my mouth to ask what the hell kind of joke he was trying to pull when I saw it. See, Grammy had a scar on her cheek from an accident when she'd been running with scissors as a kid, and there it was, carved into the granite of the statue. The more I looked, the more I saw. Her wrinkles, the shape of her eyes, the earrings she always wore. I gasped and sat down beside my grandpa. I don't know how long we sat there, staring at the unmoving idol that was my Grammy. The sun was up, and it was intensely bright before either of us moved from that spot. We decided to move. Grandpa kept the house, leaving Grammy and the young there. I think he hopes one day she'll come back, somehow. We've got a small house down the street that I help pay for now, the two of us worried about leaving her alone too much. We take turns visiting her. Sometimes she's moved in one room or another of the house. We both know neither of us are moving her or the now hundreds of various sized young that always seem to move out of our way when we visit. I think she likes it there, amongst her vast collection. An antiquities dealer and a religious figurine. I'm sure I don't need to tell you, dear listeners, that religion and religious stories have mentions of many, many objects of power. The Spear of Destiny, Zeus's lightning bolt, the Eye of Horus, and so on. Many religions even believe that statues or figurines of their various deities have direct connections to those deities. I must admit to being intrigued here. The idea of a figurine having young does seem an odd interpretation. I find myself wondering how aware the grandmother was of the powers in that object. Was this what she wanted all along? Did the object twist her desires? And what of this so-called Anton Scrivener? I can't help but feel that the name is somewhat familiar, but maybe it's in a saga I've read somewhere. I'll have to look through my files to find out. Were they aware of the true nature of this snake god statue? Did they sell it knowing what would happen? How many other objects have they sold like this? The more sagas I read, the more questions I seem to have. As another tale draws to a close, I thank you, Dark Wanderer, is it not? Did this tale convince you? Are you a believer now in the dark? Or do you hold fast to your beliefs of science and the laws of physics? Please let me know. I do love hearing from you all. Until the next, let's cross that veil together.